Hey guys, welcome back to our second episode on the United Kingdom, a country that has had 7 prime ministers in 10 years. So, after a brief recap of the 7 prime ministers that the United Kingdom has had last episode, today we're going to try to answer the important question: is Britain ungovernable? Now, what do you think, Jambo?
Mm, I think having a lot of prime ministers does not necessarily that means that it is ungovernable. I think one counter argument to the ungovernable is that Kia did passed a lot of laws and bills in his brief period in the House of Commons. Yeah, so I do think that there is still progress. It's not like a government parallel like we've seen in like perhaps Belgium or France uh in the couple of years ago, where the government just stopped working and they have to replace prime minister every few weeks or perhaps every few months. So I think it's certainly a better situation than that. Yeah.
Well, the British media has also asked this question to the prime ministers, and every time the prime ministers get this question, they always say no. So there's a joke in the media, I think, and that's if you ask any other person, they would probably say, yeah, at the very least, the United Kingdom is pretty hard to govern and stuff like that. But when you ask the current prime minister, they aren't going to say yes. So that's kind of funny, but I guess it's very expected. Um, and yeah, I guess it's fair to say that the United Kingdom has faced many issues. I think as we talked about last episode, the past 10, in the past 10 years, the 6 prime ministers before Andy Burnham, all of them had, I would say, quite extraordinary circumstances. Some had to deal with Brexit, others with the pandemic, others with regional security issues. So I personally think that all of them did face difficulties, and that has made their job much more difficult. Um, and one thing, and many of these were, foreign issues, foreign policy issues, and as a result, they haven't had much time to address issues at home. For example, structural issues in the social care system or the National Health Service, and that, as we mentioned last episode, that's something Andy Burnham is trying to do. Um, yeah, when you ask the British public today what their main issues are, answers that always come up are the cost of living, NHS, and immigration. Um, but I don't think this is particularly the prime minister's fault. I think these are issues that are generally faced by the whole world because of international phenomena such as wars, right? For example, wars in Ukraine, wars in Iran. They push up the price of natural gas and other types of energy, which through cost-pushed inflation hurts the whole economy, driving up the cost of living. The pandemic obviously didn't help the economic situation, and the rise of right-wing populism from around the world has led to immigration being a pretty big issue. So I personally think that um, it's a very difficult situation, but I don't really think it's the fault of the prime ministers because, I mean, while some of them perhaps weren't the most competent, they have been faced with pretty extraordinary challenges, and many of these challenges are faced around the world. And it's not just the UK that is struggling with these difficulties. What do you think, Jambo?
I agree to a certain extent. Yeah, you mentioned that UK has been facing a lot of challenges arising from the global landscape. But I think that maybe we have entered a stage, or we have always been in the stage where, like, it is quite normal to have challenges abroad. In terms of like in the whole world, like think about it, like perhaps before the pandemic, we also have the rise of extremism, the rise of right wing populism across Europe. And before that, we have the immigration crisis, and before that, we have the global financial crisis. the Great Recession, and even before that, we have like wars in the Middle East, right? So I think that perhaps in the 21st century, it is quite possible for countries, especially for countries that are more integrated into the global economic system, to feel these shocks, perhaps periodically. Perhaps this is a kind of cost for global integration, that you have to face recessions and those supply shocks that are coming from other countries. Well, I think the prime ministers, I think they should be expected to deal with those challenging circumstances and situations. That's because I think that is what the population are expecting them to do, right? Yeah, so we should move on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, we're gonna discuss like we said that the UK has like 7 prime ministers in the past 10 years, right? But the topic of our podcast is actually why Britain appears to be ungovernable, and why are there so many prime ministers in the past few years. So, what do you think?
Well, um, I personally think, like when you look at the reasons of uh each of the prime minister's resignation, I personally still think that there were, like, I would say in most cases, uh, like actual difficulties that existed, objective difficulties and challenges that existed that led to their resignation. I think what started this quick change, the sequence of rapidly changing prime ministers, is the Brexit referendum. And
Mhm,
I think Brexit has indeed brought a lot of instability to British politics, because on the one hand, delivering Brexit was hard, and on the other hand, the effects and impacts of Brexit are also uh, have also been difficult to manage. And I think that has added a whole layer of you know instability and difficulty to British politics, and added a lot of work onto the table of the British prime ministers when we are already living in very difficult times. But other countries, or countries around the world, are all dealing with, all dealt with a pandemic, and are all dealing with right wing populism and wars and supply shocks. But having to first negotiate and then deal with the fallouts of Brexit is something that is unique to the United Kingdom, and I think that has certainly hurt them, and it has diverted the attention of the prime ministers. They could be focused on other things, whether domestic or foreign, but now they have to focus. They, like, at least the previous prime ministers, when they were delivering it, and also certainly prime ministers today, they devote a lot of time to Brexit. Something that, okay, maybe eventually they would have had to have gone through this, but still, I think regardless of the reasons, it's clear that Brexit has certainly um, made British politics more volatile and unstable.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. I
Mm.
kind of agree with what you're saying. Yes, it is. Brexit probably dealt quite a blow to the British politics, in that it not only like makes a lot of people unsatisfied, but during like May's government and Johnson's government, where there are dissatisfaction towards the handling of the Brexit vote. And I think as time goes by, you'll also see the broader economic implication of Brexit in the next few years. And as we've also said, economy definitely, I think, kind of contributed not only towards dissatisfaction towards the government, and perhaps also to the right wing extremism, and that economic challenges is not only the cost push inflation because of rising energy prices since the Russo-Ukrainian war, but also the in equal development across England and the United Kingdom, where the economy is extremely London-centric, and the deindustrialization and the accompanying job loss, especially unemployment for the youth and for those previously industrialized areas, that those people are having a hard time to trust the government.
Mm.
Hmm. Yeah, and also perhaps the rise of populism also contributed because as we've discussed in our last episode that like if Labour were to lose, they were not to lose to Conservative, they were to lose to a more radical opponent, that is the Reform Party, which was currently ahead in the polls and will be expected to win a huge majority of the parliament, that they will be able to, I think, to form a majority government without the need for a junior party. I think that's what the poll suggested uh, at least a few weeks before, and perhaps the dynamics will change, but I think it is still too early to call. And I think this is also why Andy Berman is trying to kind of reform the electoral system towards a more proportional representation. At least that's what GPT told me, because they knew that it is impossible to keep reform out of the government in this current electoral system in the United Kingdom, because it systematically rewards larger parties and formation of a two-party system. So either Labour or Conservatives will die, and it is certainly much more easy for reform to win a overwhelming majority, that they are able to form a government if we have this single member district electoral rules in the future. Yeah. And yeah, also big tent parties. So yeah, because UK politics was traditionally dominated by two parties, that is the Labour and the Conservatives. So like people within the Labour, there are actually, and within the Conservatives, there are actually a wide array of voices in terms of what's their opinion on certain social issues and social and economic issues. So I think this is also prone to have MPs disagree with each other, which would ultimately contribute to a withdrawal of confidence towards the prime minister. Yes.
Yeah, and also to add briefly on that, and also the Brexit point that I made before, I think that another reason that prime ministers have come and go quickly after Brexit is perhaps after Brexit, there's no one to blame except for the prime minister. So before, when things didn't go well, the Conservative Party, for example, I think Boris Johnson likes to do this. Things don't go well, they point at the EU, and when we leave after we leave the European Union, things will be great. But now after leaving the European Union, you don't really have much to blame except for maybe immigrants, and you can also blame like Labour likes to blame the Conservatives or the previous administration, but both of those reasons don't seem like the best reasons, right? Like for Labor won't blame immigration, but the Conservatives from time to time did blame immigration, and of course, for right-wing parties will blame immigration, but they're not in power yet. But basically, um, the point I'm trying to make is that, and I don't think this is like a central or extremely important point, but certainly I think, after Brexit, there was one less thing to blame, which was the European Union. So the head of government, or the head of government, the prime minister got slightly more blame than he did in the past, and for example, backbenchers, they demand accountability and stuff like that, and
Yeah.
so yeah, it may also be slightly more volatile. Hmm.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so we mentioned a lot of factors that have maybe be the direct causes of the political instability that we are currently seeing in the United Kingdom. So I think there are also certainly a lot of more institutional and long-term factors that are playing a huge role in the political instability in UK right now, because we are also seeing perhaps, for example, in Germany, whereas I guess the energy shock is more profound because Germany imports a lot more gas and oil from Russia previously, which is something I learned from Prisoner of Geography reading today. And yeah, in Germany there were also lots of immigration problems, and there are also the right-wing extremism problem, which I believe are also kind of more pronounced than perhaps UK. But as we see in Germany, the government I think only collapsed once uh, in the past 10 years.
I think Germany has had three prime ministers or three chancellors in the past 10 years.
Yeah, but one is because of election, right? And the another is
Yeah, yeah. So Merkel，那个光头还有 Merz，
Schultz.
哎，光头叫啥来着？
Schultz.
啊，对，Scholz，失
Yeah.
误是，对，Scholz 啊，
Yes.
嗯，
And if we see perhaps the Netherlands, the situation, or Spain, or perhaps Portugal, I think it's if not seeing as many prime ministers as we do, perhaps in the United Kingdom. So the first factor that I would love to point out is a weak executive and a strong party. So what exactly is that? Uh, so that a strong party refers to that perhaps the party itself, the institution in the parliament, it carries a lot of weight. Its leaders have a strong say in what the party is pursuing, and the party has a strong control over its policies and its legislatures. But at the same time, we've also seen the executive in the United Kingdom is perhaps comparatively weaker than other places. Whether it's those presidential democracies where there are presidents, such as in the United States, or perhaps even to a lesser degree, the executive is even weaker than the other perhaps parliamentary ones, because prime minister it is the first among equals, and perhaps sometimes in cabinet, like prime minister cannot dictate what other ministers, perhaps for example environment ministers or education ministers are thinking. I think it is more of a collaborative decision process, and also because of the parliamentary setting that the prime minister they cannot really like directly I think like engage in a lot of like agenda pushing, and it is ultimately come down to the MPs inside the parliament that decides which policy ultimately gets passed. So the policy in the legislature, they have a lot of power, and on the other hand, the prime minister or the executive, it does not really have that much power. So I would characterize it as kind of a weak executive. Especially you also have devolution going on right now in the United Kingdom, where the power of the executive is perhaps more limited, so it is really a very limited executive. And I think under this power structure and this power dynamics, where there is a huge imbalance of power, perhaps between the party and the executive, where the party is much more powerful. So it is much more easier, for example, to initiate a for the party to withdraw their confidence from the executive, because uh, they, as I said, they are much more powerful, and prime minister he does not really have that leverage when the backbenchers, a lot of backbenchers are revolting against him. So I think that is certainly a reason why, and uh, we certainly do not expect to see, for example, a lot of like members of the parliament withdrawing their confidence towards the chancellor, because in other, perhaps even parliamentary democracies, the reason for their government to collapse is not because their party withdraws their confidence, it's because their coalition parties, for example, that's what happened in Germany, where the Free Democratic Party withdraw their confidence uh, in the shows government. So I think this is certainly a reason why it is that makes British politics especially volatile. You seem to have a
Well,
lot of comments.
no, I have a question. Basically, the past 7 or 6 prime ministers, how many of them were actually forced out by their own party? Like Starmer obviously was forced out by his own party, but like by the revolting backbenchers. But like, were the previous ones really forced out by their own power? Was it like the powerful party that forced them out? For like, especially the conservative prime ministers who got sacked.
I don't know that well, but I would say that it is certainly the party that made the decision to.
The party will vote and vote. Vote. The party will vote, and I guess that like ultimately the direct reason will obviously be their own party because the party will start to vote of no confidence, and either the prime minister doesn't survive this and gets kicked out, or they resign preemptively because they don't want to go through this. Um, and yeah, I guess it is probably true that the UK Parliament, or especially the majority party, um, is more able to kick out their executive than other like institutions are.
Yeah, and I also think this also ties in to the tradition of UK parties, where they kind of resign when things don't really pan out well, which we do not see in every other democracies, I will have to say.
Mm,
Okay, so the next major institutional factor that I want to mention here is the salience of local issues. And this was pretty much inspired by some uh, interviews I've watched in the past few weeks. I've watched interview towards the Makersfield electorate, which is where Berman was elected, and also the Clayton electorate, where uh, Nigel Farage will be standing in an election in which he is only opposed by kind of a satire politician that aims to grab headlines. So to prove that he's innocent or to kind of run away from some kind of parliamentary questionings. And yeah, and so I think one reason and one takeaway from all of those uh, interviews is that like local issues are really a divide, like a driving force in British politics, especially electoral politics, where people do care about whether this parliament is from local, not this parliament, this MP is a local, and whether the member of parliament is willing to fight for local interests, for example, to build a park, or for example, to build some roads or improve the local infrastructure. And I think this is not what we are seeing in other big democracies, especially like the United States, and perhaps even other countries where people are basically either divided by their demographics or either divided by their ideologies. And but I think in UK, although these two factors certainly also divide, the electorate, the local factors are also quite a big dividing factors. And the reason why I think the local factors play such a big role um, in the British politics is first because the country is obviously rather small, and it is comparatively still quite homogeneous in terms of demographically speaking, although that is changing really rapidly as immigrants from Asia and especially I think South Asia move into the United Kingdom. But basically, it is still very homogeneous. Where the small electorate, I've actually seen kind of an article analyzing that where UK has one of the highest like like national politician and constituency to population ratio, which means that a politician tends to represent a lot less people in the United Kingdom as opposed to other countries in terms of relative terms. And I think this also has certainly drive the salience of local issues in the United Kingdom. Yes. And because the electorate is so small that you will actually have a chance to to connect to perhaps the politician that you're electing to the parliament as opposed to other countries, which I will also take the United States as an example. Because the electorates are typically quite large, no matter in terms of population or in terms of geographic areas. And so I think what this has caused is that we've seen in the parliament, like some of the uh, members of parliament, they might not really be ideologically convinced, or their electorate might not be really ideologically aligned with the party, but instead, local favors are playing a huge role. So, I mean, I think this also means that uh, like the party, they do not have that much ideological cohesion as perhaps we see in other countries, and perhaps electorates, they are also quite prone to change to another party where the politicians did not uh, get those local favors, as opposed to what we see in the United States, where the country is really polarized, where people would vote for a politician even if like he is corrupt and he is morally questionable, and he is kind of a puppet to the government. But that would not happen in the UK because local interest, as I've mentioned a lot of times, is a key factor here. So as I said, so there is less cohesion in parties, and because local interests are playing a role and the ideology is not that coherent, so I do think that the party is not united by a single ideology, so perhaps backbenchers are more prone to revolt and express their dissatisfaction towards the prime minister, perhaps because of this. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I think that the House of Commons elections in the United Kingdom, it shows that what you just described shows that the district system is actually is still working as it was meant to be. Basically, the electorate of each district votes according to the candidates there and what those candidates will do for the interests of their respective district, as opposed to voting uh, directly and blindly, frankly, for the party of your liking. I guess that's what happens mostly in the United States, where if you're a Republican, you may not even know, that your district representative, but you're still going to vote for them because, you want a Republican you want a Republican majority in the House of Representatives. But yeah, I guess in the UK, the system is still working as it was intended to, right? The each district has their interests and views represented, and people vote for what each candidate in each district is willing to do for that district, as opposed to voting blindly according to party or ideology.
Yeah, I think it is certainly a mix of ideologies and perception towards the candidates and to what degree the candidate will help the constituency. Yes, because I think a lot of like per UK election laws, you do not have to be residing in the constituency to stand for the election. You do not even have to be in the United Kingdom to stand for the election. So, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and there's one last hypothesis that is journalistic and social media chain, and I think this is quite straightforward. Where in the perhaps in the 1970s or the 60s, you don't really know that much about like how other people are feeling towards the prime minister, whether it's dissatisfaction or anger or support. But nowadays you have internet, you have social media where perhaps if you are not even perhaps you have a neutral view towards the prime minister and somebody is criticizing them on the social media and you felt that they have a good point and you echo with that, I think that yeah, it will. You probably will also be dissatisfied with the prime minister too. So I think the social media has certainly made it much more easier to build a movement that whether it is opposing or favoring the prime minister and the government incumbents. And I think in particular, it has also been quite useful in building a coalition that, as we see, has rejected a lot of prime ministers in the last few years. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think, with social media, especially negative views, and negative sentiments, toward, for example, a prime minister or any leader really can spread very quickly. And even if they aren't entirely true, right? There's no one to fact check them.
Mhm.
Um, there's no one to fact check them at the moment, and it can spread. And some of the things that are portrayed in social media can seem very sensational and be very evocative for the general public. So yeah, I think certainly, and I personally think that this ability, of course, this ability or this impact of social media can, of course, be positive and negative, but I think it happens more, uh, at least in terms of politicians, to be negative, this impact, and yeah, that certainly I think does also contribute to prime ministers' fall from grace and their
Mhm.
eventual resignation.
Yeah, because clearly social media is playing a lot of important roles in current political landscape, I think, not in terms of electoral politics, but also in mobilizing protest and yeah, especially I think we've seen in 2025 a lot of Gen Z protests, whether it's in Nepal or Madagascar or something like that.
Yeah, so after talking about the last 10 years and why there's been seven prime ministers in the last 10 years, uh, you know, I'd also like to talk about something that I find fairly interesting, and that is uh, the I think the pretty extensive amount of time UK prime ministers have spent on foreign policy ever since the end of the Second World War. And I think there are two main reasons for this. First reason is, and I think it all ties to what happened after World War II, and what the United Kingdom was like before World War II. Before World War II, and especially before World War One, the United Kingdom was the empire on which the sun never sets. Right, it was the uh,
Yeah.
largest superpower around the world. And the interesting thing about World War II for the United Kingdom is, even though they won the war, even though they were victorious, um, they didn't their status as the world's leading superpower did not persist through the war. After the war, it was quite clear that the United States was the leading power, and the United Kingdom was not. And this, I personally think, um, this I personally think caused the leaders of the United Kingdom to be in many cases preoccupied with foreign policy and diplomacy for much of the time after the Second World War. One reason is because one thing that the Americans especially pushed after the Second World War to weaken the British to an extent is decolonization. It was written in the UN Charter, and um, yeah, obviously, the country that was hurt most by the United Kingdom was by decolonization was the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom had to spend a lot of time on um, on these issues. They had to sort out their colonial relationships, sometimes very poorly. For example, the partition of India and Pakistan obviously didn't go very well. Um, and they also, but at the same time, they also tried to hold on to some influence. For example, they had to try to continue the Commonwealth after their kingdom uh, or after their territories were decolonialized in the new international system. Um, so that was one reason, they were forced to engage in many of these decolonial issues, whether in Asia, Africa, and really around the world, because they had so many of these colonial territories. And the other reason I personally think is that the United Kingdom, more or less, because they were such a global superpower for the last 200 years, their leaders and their people, perhaps to a lesser extent, but I personally think their leaders still wanted to hold some influence on the world stage. And quite honestly, I think it's important to hold influence on the world stage because um, in the world today, it is quite often the case that foreign policy and domestic politics they are rather entwined. Um, and the sad thing for the United Kingdom was after the end of the Second World War, they themselves did not have the power to really be a global superpower and still uh, have the influence that they would like to have on the world stage. And so for their continued influence and also perhaps more importantly their further development, you know, I think that their leaders, especially Churchill, tried to turn to diplomacy and cultivating relationships with important powers around the world. And of course, one of the most important relationships they had to cultivate was that one with the new hegemon or the new strongest superpower in the United States. But another, choice that they have always had, given their geographical proximity, is with Europe. And the third choice that they have had, uh, and one that is perhaps less realistic, but has certainly been on the rise in the past 20 years, is global Britain. In fact, this was coined by a um, this was coined by the British Parliament when they were, campaigning when certain Leave uh, MPs were were campaigning for Brexit. The name that they initially used was British Empire 2.0, but that didn't go very well with the public or across the world. So they changed the name to Global Britain. So I think these three relationships and these three choices are three choices that have contributed greatly to what the United Kingdom has been doing the past 80 years since the end of the Second World War. Um, and yeah, I know Jumbo doesn't really agree with this. So what do you think about this?
Uh, I'm not really disagreeing with this, but I currently did not find there's any connection between this and the Gumbo, so perhaps you could still go in and when we find out the connection, and I perhaps could make some comments.
Yeah, so one might be curious, what's the relationship between this identity crisis after the Second World War and the fact that, or the idea that Britain is ungovernable. Well, I think, the first thing, as I mentioned before, is that, you know, it happens whether, the British leaders are, proactively wanting to be engaged on the world stage, or they are forced to be engaged because of, decolonial issues. I personally think that for the past 80 years, the United Kingdom has been pretty absorbed and it has, been pretty occupied. Its leaders, at least, have been pretty preoccupied with international affairs, uh, overly so, I would say. The second reason is that I personally think that uh, deep down the British still see themselves as if not a superpower, still as a very strong country on the international stage. Um, and I think that is still, slightly above, their expectations are still slightly above their actual capacity. And because, Britain has never fully adjusted its image to its actual capacity, um, you know, they aren't, quite simply, they aren't able to afford much of many of the goals that they want. They want to be, a global hub for diversity and education. They want to be a military power with bases all over the world. They want to have um, a generous welfare state, all while being a low tax economy. For example, they have welfare benefits, but they also have the lowest tax in Europe, in taxes in Europe. I think I read a news outlet the other day which said that British people um they want European welfare with American taxes, and that's just unsustainable, especially given how, for example, they still have a good amount of military bases around the world, um, and they want all these goals at the same time. The reality is, you know, uh, what they can afford is only a few of these uh, a few of these goals because they don't have the ability um, they don't have the ability to afford and carry all of these things out. But the result of the expectation gap between reality and expectation is that every incoming government has to promise these things, right? To, for example, restore the UK's image on the international stage while also restoring the NHS and things like that. The fact is, the United Kingdom simply isn't able to do that in the world today, and the government fails, and the public is dissatisfied with the government. They think the system is broken, and they lose confidence. Voters lose confidence, then MPs representing those voters lose confidence, and the leaders are voted out. Um, Another reason I think that has contributed to why this identity crisis and their subsequent goals have have led to the UK being difficult to govern is because people just have differing views on the path they should take forward. Certain leaders and certain parties that they represent believe that they should be closer with U.S. For example, Thatcher and Blair. They should follow American-style capitalism and go along with deregulation and deindustrialization, and you know really use the city of London and become financial centers and stuff like that. I think this is an underlying reason for many of the issues that they are facing. I think the clearest example is, perhaps Brexit, right? A very important reason of Brexit was that, the UK wanted to take back sovereignty and take back control from the European Union and Brussels. They didn't want, um, for example, rules and regulations from the United Kingdom, from the European Union, to limit what they can or can't do in the United Kingdom. And I think that is, you know, uh, many people, for example, the leading leave politicians, they often talked about, as we can see here, global Britain. They talked about a Britain that can be great on the world stage, independent from Europe. And I think in many cases that is the result of their identity crisis, their continued confidence in themselves that they are different, and their unwillingness to be subordinate to any country, especially the Europeans. And I think that certainly to a certain extent uh, caused Brexit, and which has in turn led to many of the issues that they are facing today.
Yeah, yeah. I think so. So your argument was that the identity crisis led to Brexit, which then led to the crisis that they're facing right now. So think this is quite a long causal mechanism, and I'm not really sure if the mechanism is really working that way. But as for Brexit, I don't necessarily believe that it is based solely, perhaps, on their identity or their self-identification as a global Britain or power. Yeah, you mentioned that they want to take back control for Brussels, but I think that was really a European thing, that a pan-European thing, that farmers, perhaps from France, they also want to take control from Brussels, and perhaps middle-class citizens from Romania and from Bulgaria, they also have this sentiment. So I don't think this is really a uniquely British thing, and therefore as we also see in 2010s, especially the late 2010s, that there are also similarly a lot of other European countries that are reconsidering their European membership. I think most prominently Italy. And yeah, so, and I also think there is an argument where Britain's willingness or its ability to withdraw from the European Union really comes down to that it was not part of the Eurozone, I think, which was because like during the initial drop of euro that the Britain was having a small financial crisis and it cannot maintain its currency to be pegged to the German mark because its foreign reserve was depleting, so that it has to cancel, so it has to withdraw from entering the eurozone where they adopt euro. And I don't think this has uh, a lot to do with that they are as a independent, not an independent, but as a self-recognition of a world power.
Yeah, but I think in terms of like, firstly, the currency, I think they had many opportunities later on to join the Eurozone, but they chose not to because they wanted to keep on to their own pound and pound sterling, which they saw as, part of their national identity. And the previous point you made about other countries also having movements from leaving the European Union, I think that's quite normal. Like even like most countries in the world have independence movements inside their own country. So I think it's quite normal that countries would have issues being in a supranational organization like the European Union. But I think it was only in like the UK where the momentum of that movement was so strong that um, you know, actions, substantial actions, like for example, holding a referendum were taken to address it. Now, of course, you could argue the referendum in 2015 was some political, you know, was some political brinksmanship from David Cameron, and he wanted to settle the matter once and for all. But I think, as you mentioned, in our previous episode, um, eventually it was still going to happen even if he didn't call the referendum there and then. Uh, and I personally still think a reason for that is because the UK still sees themselves as a power that can exist outside of Europe, with their other relationships. Uh, and for example, their close relationship with the United States, and also um, their own ability to trade with other countries around the world. So yeah, of course, I think Brexit. One thing was the fact that the UK has never really felt Europe, felt European. They've been on they're on the European continent, but they've never truly felt European, whether it's throughout history or in recent times when the European was founded at first. But I think certainly, why many of the Leave voters voted Leave was because, they believed that for the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, they should have power in their own hands, and they are going to be able to um, to use your own two hands to create a better future for themselves using their wealth, their influence, and their ability on the world stage. Uh, so it's still financially and economically plausible for them to leave the European Union. They can exist without it because of their ability. So I think that certainly still play, I think it still played a role in their decision to leave the United Kingdom, the European Union. And I think that still comes from, um, there's still the still present confidence that they have from previously being the world's largest superpower.
Hmm. I think that might play a role, but when we review the 2015 Brexit referendum, I think what's really the defining element or the defining topic there, it is immigration, isn't it? It is because there was the massive wave of the immigration crisis, where in 2014 and 2015 from Syria and other sorts of, and perhaps Yemen and other Middle East and some African countries, where I think UK was forced, under agreements with other European Union countries, they were forced to take in a lot of immigrants, and people weren't really happy with that, especially voters. And I think Nigel Farage really capitalized on this dividing issue and made a political gain out of it by uh, framing Brexit as something to battle for the identity of UK, but the identity of UK not as a previous
Yeah,
world power, but as a
mhm.
country that is Anglo-Saxon and white and Protestant. I think that's the point. And also, I think I've just
Yeah,
reviewed it. Another thing that they want to withdraw, other than sovereignty, which is I think a shared concern among many different countries, is that they've been sending a lot of money to less developed European Union member states, similar to what more affluent United States state have to do, such as California. They receive less than $1 for every federal tax they paid to the Washington D.C. Right? Britain is still much doing. Actually, I think it is not actually receiving less, but Nigel Farage somehow that the public believes that it's a losing deal economically, which many believe wasn't the case. So
yeah, but like I think for example, now this not may be that good of a point now that I think about it, but um, like the UK wasn't the only country, for example, giving money to less affluent countries. The more affluent countries, all of the more affluent countries in the European Union were doing that. Giving more money to less affluent countries, like for example Germany and France, and yet they aren't leaving. Though I guess there are certain reasons for that. So that's not that good of a point, I guess. Um, but the previous point I wanted to make on immigration, I think the United Kingdom signed a treaty with the European Union that they wouldn't take in any of those people. Uh, for example, they never joined the region, and I don't think they really were going to take in those people. Most of the immigrants or the people that came in into the United Kingdom when they were in the European Union were white. You're like people from like Poland and stuff like that. Uh, so I don't think that's like that accurate.
yeah, maybe that was the case, but I would say that immigration was certainly a really dividing issue. But do you think they have to take in immigrants during the European Union immigration crisis there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, I guess this might be an excuse, but an excuse for their racism and their anti-immigrant nature. But yeah, I think the excuse that they were giving back then was they wanted to take back control. Though now I think about it, I don't think it was that much about taking back control, but another a nice excuse for saying that they didn't want basically brown and people who weren't white coming in.
Mm.
But the reason they gave was still, taking back control. Uh, mm.
Mm. So should we move on?
Yeah, I'd like to make one last point. I think I should probably expand the interpretation of the identity crisis not only to um, yeah, I guess another idea that I just had is basically the identity crisis or their longing to continue to exert influence on the international stage after World War II led them to have basically three main choices. They can exert influence as the closest ally and partner of the strongest power in the world in the United States, or they could choose to work closely with Europe and the European Union and exert power as a European power, or they could, thirdly choose to be global Britain and, exert power uh, like they did in the past as an independent United Kingdom. Um, because of their longing to, continue to exert influence after they lost the capacity to do so on the international stage, they had these three factions or these three, factions at home, and this has, you know, uh, to an extent, influenced their politics and has, caused decisions. For example, when, for example, again, Brexit, um, when the faction of Global Britain wins out over the faction of Europe, they vote for Brexit.